Usually when we look at a towering skyscraper or a massive suspension bridge, there is this baseline expectation of structural integrity.
Right, you assume it's actually built to stand up.
Exactly. You stand at the bottom of a 60-story building, you look at the steel beams, the load-bearing walls, the deep concrete foundations, and there's a comforting logic to it.
It's mathematically sound.
Yeah. An architect or a structural engineer could pull up the blueprints, point to a specific column, and say, that right there, that is mathematically proven to hold up the weight.
I mean, it's entirely empirical. You don't have to take the building stability on faith.
Right.
The mathematics of tension and compression are doing the work, and the evidence of that work is entirely visible.
Supported or not supported, the math either works or the building falls down. It's clean.
Very clean.
But then you take that same analytical mindset and you step into the world of human societies.
Oh, and it gets messy fast.
So fast. You look at empires, massive political regimes, sprawling global economic systems, and suddenly that clean structural logic just vanishes.
It completely evaporates.
It really does. If you really look closely at the civilizational landscape, it is structurally terrifying. We are constantly surrounded by these massive, imposing institutions that, when you peek behind the curtain, seem to be floating on thin air.
Which is the absolute definition of a structural illusion.
Yes.
A facade of monumental stability resting on a foundation of absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
And history is just littered with these illusions. I mean, regimes that looked invincible on a Tuesday and completely collapsed by Thursday.
It's gone.
Simply because the underlying math of their society was entirely fictional.
And that structural illusion is exactly what we are dissecting today. So welcome to this deep dive.
It's going to be an intense one.
It really is. Our mission today is incredibly unique and honestly a bit intense. We are looking at a stack of source material that centers on a detailed, highly analytical lecture. The subject of this lecture is a 7th century foundational text, specifically Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 67 to 71. But here is the critical framing for you listening. We are examining this text strictly, and I mean exclusively, through the lens of sociology and systems engineering.
Exactly. We are stripping away all the traditional theology.
All of it.
All the religious sentimentality, the preaching, it's gone.
We are treating this source text as a masterclass in civilizational survival.
Because if you read the text sociologically, it is an operating manual.
An operating manual, yeah.
We are looking for the raw mechanics of how human societies either endure the test of time or inevitably collapse under their own weight.
Our goal is to extract the structural laws of power and authority. And whether you're analyzing the hierarchy of a modern tech monopoly, a dysfunctional corporate workplace, a political regime, or a historical empire, the sources suggest you're going to see these exact same patterns of collapse.
You see them everywhere.
But to get there, I need some help setting the baseline. In the notes, the author insists that we cannot even begin this conversation until we understand the distinction between two specific terms.
Right, this is crucial.
The terms are Deen and Madhhab. Now, I've always heard both of those translated simply as religion. Why is that translation a problem here?
Well, translating both as religion completely neuters the sociological weight of the text.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. That distinction is the linchpin of this entire analysis.
Okay, so walk me through it.
The author argues that in its original, operational 7th century context, a deen is not a religion at all.
Not at all.
Not in the way we use the word today. It is a comprehensive socio-economic system of justice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, think of it as a state apparatus. It is a central authority, which the text calls an Amr, that is actively designed to establish equity, or adal, across a society.
So it's a structural thing.
Exactly. It is a load-bearing, functional system of laws governing economics, resource distribution, human rights, and civic duty.
Okay, so Deen is the actual machinery of a functioning society.
Right.
It's the tax code, the courts, the infrastructure, the social safety net. It's the blueprint of the skyscraper.
That's a great way to put it. It is the systemic reality of justice. Now, contrast that with a madhhab.
Okay, what's a madhhab?
According to source material, a madhhab is what happens when that actual functioning system, the deen, rots from the inside and dies.
Oh, man.
When the machinery of justice breaks down, what are you left with? You are left with a hollowed-out shell.
Just the remnants.
Right. A madhhab is a religion in the traditional modern sense. It is mere dogma, aesthetic practices, personal worship, and isolated rituals.
So it has no actual power.
None. It has no central authority, no socio-economic power, no capacity to enforce systemic justice. It is literally the ghost of a dead system.
A ghost is the perfect word. A deen is a living, breathing body, and a madhhab is just the shadow it leaves behind.
Exactly.
But wait, if the system of justice is dead, why don't the people notice? Why do humans so readily accept the ghost?
Well, because the ghost is comfortable.
Comfortable? How so?
Think about it. Building and maintaining a deen, a true system of justice, requires immense, constant sociological effort.
Right, it's hard work.
It requires sacrifice, wealth redistribution, holding a powerful accountable, and maintaining a rigorous standard of evidence.
Yeah, that takes a lot of friction.
But a madhhab only requires you to perform a ritual.
Oh, I see.
You can perform a ritual in your living room for 10 minutes, feel a profound sense of personal righteousness, and then go right back out into a profoundly unjust world without having to change a single thing about it.
That is wild, which brings us to the ultimate hook for this entire sociological framework.
The anchor for the whole argument.
Right. In the source material, the author points to a specific verse, 22.71. It reads, let me get this right. They serve besides God that for which he has sent down no authority or sultan, and of which they have no knowledge.
Yeah, that's the one.
Now, when most people read that, the immediate assumption is that it's a historical critique of idol worship. Like, don't pray to a wooden statue.
Sure, that's the standard theological read.
But the author says that interpretation completely misses the point.
The author insists it's not about statues even slightly. The genius of this analysis lies in unpacking that word, sultan.
Okay, let's unpack it.
Medieval translations often render that word as a king or a ruler wearing a crown.
Yeah.
But linguistically, and within the context of systems theory, sultan means warranted authority.
Warranted authority.
Yes, it means an evidence-backed mandate.
So we're moving from a theological warning about idols to a massive epistemological argument.
It becomes a universal rule for human behavior.
Wow.
The text is stating that to obey a system, a leader, a law, or an institution for which there is neither demonstrated authority nor empirical knowledge is the very definition of irrational submission.
This completely reframes the verse. It's an indictment of baseless power.
Exactly.
It's essentially saying, show me the blueprints.
Yes. It is a sweeping sociological indictment of every baseless claim to power in human history.
Right.
Ask yourself, why do populations obey unjust, extractive regimes?
Right. Or why do modern workers submit to corporate structures that actively impoverish them?
Exactly. The text answers this clearly. Because they have submitted to an authority that has no sultan.
No evidence.
It has no evidence of its legitimacy. There is no empirical proof that the regime or the corporation actually serves the cause of systemic justice or equity.
So when you submit to power without evidence, you are literally giving away your agency to a phantom.
And when a society does that on a mass scale, when millions of people submit to unevidenced authority, whether it's a political dictator ruling by fiat, a corrupt financial algorithm, or a religious hierarchy demanding blind obedience, that society has initiated its own decay.
You're trying to build your civilization on a foundation that does not exist.
And it will fall.
I want to dig into the mechanics of that decay, because it doesn't happen overnight.
No, it's a process.
Right, so how does a society transition from having a robust, evidence-backed system of justice, a true deen, into a population that just blindly submits to empty, baseless authority?
Well, the author provides an incredibly vivid metaphor to illustrate how this hollowing out process works. It's the metaphor of the village soldier.
Oh, I was reading through this part of the notes, and it's such a brilliant, slightly heartbreaking image.
It really is.
For you listening, imagine this scenario. You have a soldier who has spent his entire life in the military.
He knows it inside out.
Right. He knows the drills, he understands the discipline, he knows exactly how to wear the uniform. Eventually, he retires and moves back to his remote, quiet village.
But he can't let it go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The military conditioning is so deep that every single morning he wakes up at 8 a.m. sharp. He puts on his old faded uniform. He laces up his boots with absolute precision.
But he's not in the army anymore.
Right. So because he doesn't have a rifle anymore, he grabs a long stick. And for 2 hours, he marches up and down the dusty village square.
Yep.
Left, right, left, right. And when he's done, he feels this intense satisfaction. He genuinely believes he is fulfilling his ultimate duty.
It's a very powerful visual. But sociologically, what is the reality of that soldier's actions?
He is accomplishing absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
There is no central command giving him orders. There is no national border he is defending. There is no logistics network, no strategy, no actual army.
It's purely aesthetic.
Purely.
The author uses this to explain exactly what happens when a deen degrades into a madhhab.
Ah, I see the connection.
When the system of justice dies, the forms remain. The fractional details, the aesthetics, the rituals of the old system, they survive.
The marching.
Right. The soldier still has his boots and his marching rhythm. The outward appearance of duty is there. But the essence, the central load-bearing system that actually gave those actions meaning, purpose, and utility in the real world is completely dead.
So his actions have devolved into meaningless rituals.
Entirely meaningless.
He's just a guy walking in circles with a stick, hallucinating that he's still an army.
Now, apply that to a civilization. How do entire societies become like that retired soldier?
How does that happen on a macro scale?
How do they become so disconnected from reality that they think marching in a circle is the same thing as defending a border? The source text provides a razor-sharp historical example: the Muslim population in British India during the colonial era.
Let's expand on this, because taking it out of the realm of metaphor and placing it into geopolitical reality really grounds the theory.
It does. So, during the height of the colonial era, the British Empire consolidated control over the Indian subcontinent. Now, from a systemic perspective, what did the colonizers do with the religious practices of the Muslim population?
Did they outlaw them?
No. The British explicitly allowed freedom of religion.
Reading the source notes, it seems the British were actually quite accommodating on that front.
Highly accommodating.
They allowed the population complete freedom to pray in their mosques, to fast, to go on pilgrimage. They even instituted what were called personal laws. This meant the colonized population could go to court and argue about marriage, divorce, and inheritance according to their own historical religious texts.
And what was the psychological effect of this on the colonized population? According to the author, they were deeply satisfied.
Wait, really?
Yes. They felt exactly like the village soldier. Because they could still execute the forms of their religion, they lived under the illusion that their system was perfectly intact. They thought, hey, the British aren't interfering with our Deen.
But the reality was that it was a devastating systemic trap.
The ultimate trap. The British granted them freedom of ritual. But look at the actual levers of civilizational power.
The real machinery.
Exactly. Who controlled the macroeconomy? Who controlled foreign policy and trade routes?
The British.
Who held the monopoly on violence? Who wrote the penal code and controlled the systemic authority?
The British Empire did. The colonizers owned all the load-bearing pillars of this society.
The core system, the actual Deen, belonged entirely to the British. The colonized population was left holding nothing but the Madhhab.
The empty shell?
The empty shell of personal rituals. But because they could still pray 5 times a day and argue endlessly over marriage laws, they were completely blinded to their own systemic powerlessness.
That's just...
The essence of their society was gone, but they were too distracted by the forms to even realize they had been conquered.
That is a staggering sociological insight. When you split a society's operational reality from its personal rituals, you effectively neutralize them.
You pacify them.
You let them march in the village square with a stick so they don't realize they have no army. I'm trying to think of how this maps onto the modern world, because it's not just a colonial phenomenon.
Oh, it happens everywhere. It's a fundamental tactic of unwarranted authority.
Right. Think about the modern corporate workplace.
Oh, perfect example.
A company might have a terribly unjust operational system. You know, they severely underpay their workers, they offer no job security, they hoard all the profits at the executive level.
The actual system is extractive.
Yes. But to keep the workforce from revolting, they offer forms of empowerment.
The rituals.
Exactly. They give you casual Friday, they put a ping pong table in the break room, they let you vote on what kind of snacks go in the vending machine.
And the workers feel a sense of agency. They feel like they have a voice.
Exactly. Well, I mean, that's the illusion. They have freedom of ritual in the break room, but the systemic authority, the actual economic power, belongs entirely to the board of directors.
They are marching in the village square.
It's a perfect parallel. The aesthetic of freedom masks the reality of subjugation.
And this brings us to a massive related concept in the source text.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a society is distracted by these forms and rituals, how should we actually view the role of methods and procedures in a healthy system?
This is where the notes go into an incredible linguistic deep dive. The author brings up Ayat 22.67, which reads, "For every community we appointed a right, or mansak, which they observe.
Mansack.
Right. Now, playing devil's advocate here, on the surface, the word rite or mansack sounds an awful lot like the very rituals we were just criticizing.
It does sound like a contradiction, doesn't it?
It really does.
But the author's sociological analysis of the word mansack prevents us from falling into that trap.
Okay. How so?
This is not an endorsement of empty rituals, nor is it mere moral relativism. This is pure systems theory.
Systems theory.
In any functional organization, every system has standard operating procedures. The mansack is not a magical, holy ritual. It is simply the method, the agreed-upon, localized procedure for executing the goals of the system.
So, different communities will naturally develop different methods based on their geography, their history, their specific context.
Precisely. The method adapts. But look at the instruction that immediately follows in the verse. Let them not dispute with you on the matter.
This leads right into the traffic laws analogy from the text, which I think is brilliant because it so cleanly separates the method from the principle. Let's break that down.
Walk us through how the author frames it.
Imagine you were looking at international traffic laws. The underlying principle, the core system of justice, or ADL in this scenario, is that human beings should be able to travel from point A to point B safely without crashing their cars into each other and causing chaos.
Right. That's the goal.
That is the non-negotiable law of the system. But the method to achieve that safety, well, if you go to the UK, the method is keep to the left. If you go to the US, the method is keep to the right.
Now, sociologically speaking, does it intrinsically matter whether humans drive on the left or the right? Is there a moral superiority to the left lane over the right lane?
No, it's completely arbitrary.
Okay.
The universe doesn't care which side of the road you drive on. What matters is that there is a central authority, the Al-Amr, that clearly enforces whichever method is chosen so that society doesn't collapse into a pile of twisted metal.
The method only exists to serve the principle.
Right.
But what happens to human psychology when we forget the principle?
We get obsessed with the method.
Exactly. The instruction, let them not dispute with you on the matter, is a direct command to avoid getting dragged into sterile method wars.
Method wars. It's such an incredibly descriptive phrase.
It is the bane of human progress. People constantly lose sight of the core principle, the safe flow of traffic, the establishment of economic equity, the pursuit of justice.
You lose the forest for the trees.
Yes. Instead, they start fighting vicious, sometimes bloody wars over whether driving on the left is holier than driving on the right.
Wow.
The text is warning the systems engineer, do not take the bait. The method is secondary to the system. You must keep the focus on inviting people to the core principle.
The verse phrases it as invite to your Lord, which the author translates not as a religious conversion, but sociologically as inviting people to submit to the central, universal laws of the system.
Right. If you want to build a functional society, you focus on the load-bearing walls, not the color of the paint.
That makes perfect sense.
But history shows us what happens when a society loses that central system. When the Al-Amr collapses, the population doesn't just quietly fade away. They fragment.
They fragment and they obsess over the mansack.
Heavily.
They become hyperfixated on the traffic laws while the roads beneath their feet are literally crumbling. And the source material provides some highly specific, deeply historical, and frankly absurd examples to illustrate this fragmentation.
The author details the factional fights that inevitably emerge when a Deen becomes a Madhhab. He lists the historical groups, Hanafis, Ahli Hadith, Shias, Sunnis.
Right.
These were massive populations in the subcontinent. And what were they dedicating their intellectual and physical energy to?
That's the tragic part. They weren't debating how to eradicate poverty under colonial rule.
No, they weren't.
They weren't building resilient economic models or pushing for human rights. The author points out they were violently arguing over whether to say the word Amin loudly or softly at the end of a communal prayer.
Or the exact physical placement of their hands during worship. Should the hands be tied above the navel, below the chest?
They argued over exactly how many words to recite, or whether a person's fingers should physically touch their earlobes when they raise their hands.
It's micromanagement of rituals.
Yes. The text notes that millions of man-hours, immense financial resources, and massive volumes of literature were dedicated to defending these micro-methodologies.
If we step back and look at this as sociologists, we have to ask the fundamental question. Why?
Yeah, why do that?
Why do human beings default to such trivialities when their entire civilization is occupied by a foreign power?
The author gives us an anecdote that perfectly captures the absolute absurdity of this mindset. It's the story of the Privy Council.
Oh, this one is amazing.
I almost couldn't believe this when I read the notes.
It is the ultimate historical irony. Tell the story.
So you have these religious factions in British India. They are colonized, they have zero systemic power, but they hate each other so deeply over these tiny methodological differences, like who is qualified to lead a prayer and how loud they're allowed to speak, that they can't resolve it amongst themselves. So what do? They take a dispute over mosque rituals to court.
And not just a local magistrate.
No. They appeal it. They take it through the colonial legal system, past the regional courts, past the high courts in India, and they appeal it all the way up to the British Privy Council in London.
London.
The supreme legal authority of the very empire that conquered them.
Just sit with the profound, devastating irony of that situation for a second.
It's unbelievable. You have a colonized people, stripped of their wealth and autonomy, and they are leveraging the colonizers' Supreme Court to adjudicate how they should fold their hands when they pray.
It's a tragic comedy.
And the kicker. The author notes that when the Privy Council finally handed down a verdict in favor of one specific sect, that sect went home and celebrated it in their local newspapers as a massive historic victory for their faith.
They celebrated a validation of their Madhhab from the exact entity that had stolen their Deen.
It's mind-blowing.
But we can't just look at this as a historical curiosity. We have to analyze the power dynamics. Who benefits from this kind of intense, localized fragmentation?
Well, the colonizers certainly benefit because the population is too busy fighting each other to fight the empire.
Yes, but locally, the vested interests benefit. The religious leaders, the localized political bosses.
Oh, right.
When the central system collapses, these local leaders need to maintain their own micro-empires of power, wealth, and prestige.
How do they do that?
Well, how do you keep a population loyal to you when you can't actually provide them with a functioning society? You manufacture an enemy.
A fake war.
You create micro-factions based on methods. You convince your followers that the people who fold their hands differently are an existential threat to their soul.
It's a distraction technique. If the masses are screaming at each other over how loud to say "Amin," they aren't looking at the real socio-economic failures. They aren't noticing that their leaders are hoarding wealth, that poverty is rampant, that there is no actual justice.
Sectarianism, in this sociological reading, is not merely a difference of theological opinion. It is the active, intentional destruction of societal unity.
Wow.
The text refers to this fragmentation as shirk. The author points out that this obsession with method wars is a sophisticated form of self-deception. The people engaged in these fights truly believe they are doing vital, world-changing work.
But structurally,
They are just the retired soldier marching in the village square, completely irrelevant to the actual levers of power.
the text mentions a modern manifestation of this illusion of progress, the World Religions Conference.
Ah, yes. The author points out the absolute inherent sterility of these grand, well-funded debates.
Let's talk about that.
Think about the structure of those conferences. You gather high-level representatives from all these different factions. They fly in from all over the world.
Everyone wears their finest traditional garments or expensive suits.
Exactly. Someone gets up to the podium and reads a highly intellectual, carefully crafted paper defending their specific ideology.
Right.
Everyone politely claps. Then the next person gets up and does the same thing.
Right.
And at the end of the weekend, everyone packs up their briefcases and goes home, clutching the exact same ideology they arrived with.
No one changes their mind. No actual material change occurs in the world. Poverty doesn't decrease. Justice isn't established.
It's just a performance.
Sterile debate achieves nothing. It's the intellectual version of marching with a stick. We see this all the time today, too.
Oh, constantly.
Think about the endless cyclical arguments on social media platforms like Twitter. People write massive threads destroying their political opponents. They get thousands of likes. They feel an immense rush of dopamine, like they've really struck a blow for justice.
But structurally, nothing in the real world shifts.
Nothing shifts. The algorithm just profits off the engagement.
It's a brilliant modern parallel.
Yeah.
The platform owns the Deen, the algorithm, the data, the ad revenue, while the users are trapped in the Madhhab of endless sterile debate.
That is deeply unsettling.
Which brings up a massive operational question for any systems engineer or reformer.
What's that?
If we know that these method wars are a trap, if we aren't supposed to argue with people over the exact right way to execute a method, what is the actual mechanism for proving that a system works?
The source text transitions here into what I think we can call the engine of reason.
The engine of reason, yes.
How does an ideology or a system prove its worth, if not through debate? The author points to Ayat 22.68 and 69. If they argue with you, say, God knows best what you do. God will judge between you regarding your differences.
It's a very specific instruction.
No, I'm going to be honest. When I first read that, my immediate reaction was to reject it.
Why is that?
It sounds incredibly passive. It sounds like a spiritual cop-out, like, hey, don't fight, just let it go and let the universe sort it out later. How is that a blueprint for civilizational engineering?
I completely understand why it reads that way on the surface. It sounds like surrender.
Right.
But the author strongly refutes any interpretation of passivity. This is not about giving up. It is a supreme, almost ruthless psychological and strategic discipline against unproductive action.
Walk me through the mechanics of that discipline.
Okay, put yourself in the shoes of a reformer trying to build a new, load-bearing society. Your most precious resources are time, energy, and focus.
Sure.
If you allow yourself to be baited into endless, sterile disputations with people who are obsessed with rituals, if you stop building the skyscraper to argue with someone who insists the foundation must be painted blue, you will drain all your energy.
You'll never finish the building.
Exactly, you will fail. The instruction of these verses is a strategic imperative. State the core principle clearly, present the evidence for the system, and then absolutely refuse to take the bait of a method war.
Demonstrate, don't quarrel.
That is the essence of it. Adjudication, the final judgment between competing systems or ideologies, is never achieved through clever arguments.
You don't win a debate.
You don't win because you had the best debate performance. You win by outcome.
This connects deeply to the concept of the cosmic record, or the kitab, which is brought up in the notes.
Yes, the kitab represents the idea that the universe operates on unchangeable, objective laws of cause and effect.
Okay, keep going.
The author brings in a fascinating, unexpected reference here to the 20th century British astronomer Sir James Jeans and the concept of the expanding universe.
I was really struck by that when I was reading. How does a 20th century astrophysicist fit into the sociological analysis of a 7th century text?
It's about understanding the nature of universal laws. Look at the laws of physics. The mechanics of an expanding universe, gravity, thermodynamics, they don't hold debates.
Right.
Gravity doesn't convene a conference to argue with you about whether a heavy object should fall to the earth. It simply executes its nature.
It just acts.
If an engineer ignores the laws of tension and builds a bridge with faulty math, the universe doesn't argue with the engineer. The bridge simply collapses. The outcome proves the law.
The results speak for themselves. The collapse is the judgment.
Now apply that to sociology. The text argues that sociological laws, the laws governing human societies, work the exact same way.
They are objective.
They are just as objective as gravity. They don't debate, they produce results. If you build an economic system on exploitation, wealth hoarding, and the deprivation of the working class, that system will inevitably produce poverty, internal instability, and eventual collapse.
And that outcome is the judgment.
Yes. Everything is kept in a record, the kitab, meaning no action in a society occurs in a vacuum. Every systemic choice yields a corresponding, inescapable result that accumulates over time.
So the directive is, stop arguing. Let the socio-economic results prove which system actually works.
That's the engine of reason.
That is a wildly pragmatic, almost brutal way to look at ideology. You don't win by having the loudest argument. You win by building a society that actually functions, a society that actually eliminates poverty, that provides empirical justice. The outcome is the verdict.
Which leads us directly into how that verdict is delivered, because the accumulation of those causes and effects eventually reaches a tipping point.
It builds up.
And this is where the author completely shatters another traditional theological translation. We have to look at the concept of Qiyamah.
Ah, yes. Qiyamah. In almost every traditional translation I've seen, this is rendered as the day of judgment, the apocalypse, the literal end of the world after everyone dies.
Traditionally, yes, it is framed as a purely eschatological post-death event. But sociologically,
How does the author read it?
the author completely redefines this term by going back to its linguistic roots. The word Qiyamah comes from the Arabic root qiyam, which literally means to stand up.
To stand up. Not the end of the world, but the act of rising.
The source argues that in the context of civilizational mechanics, Qiyamah is a sudden, revolutionary structural upheaval happening in this world.
Wow.
It is the moment the accumulated results in the kitab finally tip the scales.
It's a civilizational turnover.
Think about the timeline of decay. A system rots from the inside out. For decades, or even centuries, a society might be consumed by endless method wars.
Like the marching soldier.
Right. Its leaders rule without sultan, without evidence, extracting wealth and ignoring systemic justice. On the surface, the skyscraper still looks tall. But the natural laws of cause and effect are accumulating in the background. The structural pressure is building.
And then suddenly, the foundation snaps. Qiyamah.
Suddenly, the verdict of history arrives. A new system, based on actual laws of justice and empirical evidence, stands up. It has its qiyam.
And the old system falls.
And to the corrupt regime that has been living on borrowed time, this sudden catastrophic upheaval feels like the literal end of the world. It feels like an apocalypse.
But it's not.
But it's not magic. It's just the natural law of cause and effect finally cashing its check.
The author brings in a massive historical example to illustrate what this civilizational qiyamah looks like in practice.
Oh, this is a great example.
He points to the ancient world, specifically the clash between the emerging Arab civilization and the established Roman and Persian empires.
Let's examine the structural reality of those empires prior to their collapse. How did they look on paper?
On paper, they were absolute behemoths. They'd been around for centuries. They possessed immense hoarded wealth, massive professional armies, and incredibly deep, complex political institutions.
They were the superpowers of their day.
And according to the historical context provided in the text, they looked at the Arabs in the desert as entirely insignificant. They viewed them as backwards, primitive camel herders who survived on date pits and camel milk.
From the perspective of Rome and Persia, the Arabs were structurally invisible. They posed zero threat to the global order.
But then a paradigm shift happened. Those so-called backwards people were unified under a new empirical system, a true Deen.
A load-bearing system.
Yes, a system based on actual social laws, rapid establishment of justice, and unified purpose rather than just hollow rituals. And driven by this new load-bearing system, they suddenly stood up.
They experienced their qiyam.
Exactly. And in an incredibly short span of historical time, they dismantled those two ancient global superpowers almost overnight.
It was a sudden, catastrophic civilizational verdict for Rome and Persia. What's fascinating here is the shock of it.
We didn't see it coming.
To the Roman and Persian elites, this collapse was literally unimaginable. It defied all their traditional metrics of power, their wealth, their cavalry, their history.
But the reality was different.
Sociologically, the author points out that those empires were already hollowed out from within. They were incredibly unjust. They were surviving purely on inertia. When a genuine evidence-backed system stood up against them, the rot was exposed and the structure shattered.
This perfectly transitions to the final and I think most chilling verse in our deep dive today. Let me just check my notes here. We are looking at the closing of Ayat 22.71. After discussing authority without evidence, the verse delivers this final conclusion, quote, "The wrongdoers will have no helper."
No helper. It sounds like a simple phrase, almost colloquial. But in systems engineering, this is the profound concept of structural fragility.
Let's go back to our skyscraper analogy from the very beginning of the deep dive.
Think of an incredibly impressive, imposing building. It has a beautiful glass facade that gleams in the sun. It has marble floors in the lobby.
It looks indestructible.
It has intimidating security guards at the doors. It projects absolute power. But the structural engineer knows a secret. There is no foundation.
It's all fake.
It's built on loose sand. A political regime or a corporate structure resting on claims with no sultan, no knowledge, has no real empirical support beneath it. It relies entirely on illusions.
It relies on people believing the illusion.
Right. It relies on the fact that the village soldier is still willing to march with his stick. It relies on extracting blind obedience through fear.
I want to view this from the perspective of an average citizen, because to a person living under one of these regimes, it doesn't look fragile. It looks terrifyingly strong.
Oh, of course it does.
They have militarized police forces. They control the global banking systems. They have vast, impenetrable bureaucracies. How can a system like that be described as having no helper and no support?
Because they are load-bearing in appearance only. This is the crucial sociological insight of the text.
Explain that.
When an authority is unwarranted, when it lacks sultan, when it does not organically serve the justice of the people, there is no genuine underlying loyalty holding it up.
There's no trust.
There is no empirical foundation of trust that bonds the citizens to the state or the workers to the corporation. The obedience they manage to extract is brittle.
It's fragile.
It's based entirely on immediate fear, historical habit, or the distraction of those sterile method wars.
It's propped up by temporary scaffolding, not by a permanent foundation.
Exactly. So when the systemic verdict arrives, when that Qiyamah moment of civilizational pressure hits, whether it's an economic crisis, a revolution, or a superior competing system, all that superficial strength vanishes in an instant.
It just vaporizes.
They have no helper. Means that because nothing real or just was supporting the structure in the hearts and minds of the people, no one genuinely steps up to save it when it starts to fall.
Wow.
The military splinters because the soldiers have no loyalty. The bureaucracy freezes. The economy seizes up. The structure instantly collapses into dust because the illusion of power has been irrevocably broken.
It's like pushing over an elaborate Hollywood movie set.
Yes, a facade.
From the front, through the camera lens, it looks like a solid brick building. But as you walk around back, you give it a hard push and you realize it's just painted plywood held up by a few 2x4s. Once the center of gravity shifts, there is nothing there to stop it from crashing down.
And that is the ultimate law of requital in sociology. Power without an evidential foundation always collapses for lack of genuine support.
It's inevitable.
Illegitimate authority cannot sustain itself indefinitely against the natural, objective laws of societal evolution. The universe simply will not tolerate a vacuum of justice forever.
Let's synthesize this incredible through line. We started this deep dive looking at a 7th century text, and by stripping away the theological assumptions, we've walked away with a master blueprint for civilizational resilience.
It's incredibly practical.
First, real authority, actual load-bearing power, must be warranted and knowledge-based. It requires a sultan. If someone demands your obedience, they must show the evidence that their system produces justice.
Second, every functioning community will naturally run its own methods, its mansack, to achieve its goals.
Yeah.
But we cannot mistake the localized method for the universal principle.
Don't fight bloody wars over whether to drive on the left or the right side of the road. Just keep the traffic flowing safely.
Exactly.
The way to advance a society is to demonstrate tangible results, to point to the cosmic record of outcomes, not to get dragged into sterile, exhausting quarrels over rituals.
Because when a society becomes obsessed with rituals while ignoring the mechanics of systemic justice, it becomes that retired soldier marching in the village square, deluded, fragmented, deeply vulnerable, and utterly powerless against the reality of the world.
And ultimately, any power structure that lacks that evidential foundation, that relies on dividing people over trivialities to hide its own systemic corruption, is structurally fragile. When the civilizational verdict arrives, the Hollywood set will fall over, and it will have no helper.
If we pull all of these sociological mechanics together into a single, unified civilizational lesson, it is this: legitimacy must be earned in evidence. Period.
It's that simple.
A society that aggressively demands evidence, sultan, for any claim to authority and utterly refuses to submit to merely asserted power has essentially built an invincible immune system.
That is the ultimate defense mechanism. If the populace refuses to obey without evidence, tyranny literally cannot take root. It cannot find the soil to grow in.
It starves the authoritarian impulse before it can even form a regime. It forces power to constantly be accountable to justice, rather than allowing justice to be subservient to power.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We spent a lot of time today talking about ancient empires, village soldiers, and historical colonial courts in British India, but I want you to bring this entirely into your present reality.
Look around you.
Think about the massive institutions that govern your life right now, today. It could be your national government. It could be the tech monopolies that control your data, your communication, and your perception of reality.
Or even smaller scale.
Right. It could be the corporate hierarchy where you spend 40 hours a week, or the opaque financial systems that dictate your economic future. If you applied the Sultan test to them today, how many of them are actually load-bearing?
That's the real question.
How many are built on warranted evidence, empirical justice, and real measurable utility for the people they claim to serve? And how many of them are just surviving on the inertia of empty rituals?
Is waiting to fall.
Just demanding your blind submission, distracting you with endless sterile method wars on social media, while they quietly, nervously wait for their civilizational verdict to arrive. Keep looking for the load-bearing walls. Keep demanding evidence in all things. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.